This episode is brought to you by VPP Simplified. Now you can get element by element guidance and progress tracking for your VPP journey. Every aspect of the VPP requirements in one easy-to-use interactive spreadsheet. It has sub-element explanations and examples. It has a stoplight status check. It includes 3-step verification of completion for each sub-element. You even get a notes section to compile your application language. And it even comes with graphs to show current state and progress moving forward. Look, achieving VPP star status can be tough, but understanding what is required to get there can be simplified. This gap tool will help you do that. Again, go to vppsimplified.com for more information.
Welcome to the Safety Pro Podcast, where we help you manage workplace safety one episode at a time. And now, your very own Safety Pro, Blaine J. Hoffman.
Okay, welcome back to another episode of the Safety Pro Podcast. I am going to talk about labels today. We've all seen them. We've all not seen them, where they're supposed to be, of course. So I'm going to give you a rundown on what OSHA requires regarding labeling chemicals in the workplace. You can find the standard at 29 CFR 1910.1200. So OSHA requires that containers of any hazardous chemicals be labeled, tagged, or marked with the product identifier, signal word, hazard statement, pictograms, any precautionary statements, supplier identification, things like that. Now, the signal word, hazard statement, and pictograms, they all have to be located together on the tag or label or whatever marking is placed on the product. For containers that leave the workplace, the label can't conflict with the requirements of any HAZMAT, or Hazardous Materials Transportation Act, and regulations issued under that act by the DOT, or Department of Transportation. So in-plant containers, these are containers that don't leave your facility, but they're used at work. They have to be labeled, tagged, or marked with the label information that I just mentioned. There are some exceptions like the supplier identification. Or they have to have the product identifier and words, pictures, symbols, or any combination of those that provide at least general information regarding the hazards of the chemicals, and in conjunction with the other information that is immediately available to the employees under the HAZCOM program that will provide employees with specific info regarding the physical and health hazards of that hazardous chemical. So you're allowed to have a basic label on in-plant containers, but it has to basically be keyed to the safety data sheet, right? So you can't have conflicting information on the label that you would have on the safety data sheet, if that makes sense. So, what kind of a scope are we looking at here? Let's get into this a little bit. Let's get into the scope of this requirement. The chemical manufacturer, the importer, or distributor has to ensure that every container of hazardous chemicals that leave the workplace is labeled, tagged, or marked. Hazards not otherwise classified, they don't have to be addressed on the container. Employers have to ensure that each container of hazardous chemicals in the workplace is labeled, tagged, and marked. Or marked, I should say. So 1910-1200 does not require labeling of the following chemicals. This is important. Now again, this is OSHA. This is 1910.1200. Does not require the labeling of the following chemicals. First one, any pesticide defined in the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act. Yes, there is one. I was shocked as well. When subject to the labeling requirements of that act and labeling regulations issued under the act by the EPA. So basically, if you already are complying with the other federal standard for labeling. Another one here is any chemical, substance, or mixture as such terms are defined in the Toxic Substances Control Act when subject to the labeling requirements of that act and labeling regulations issued under the act by the Environmental Protection Agency. So TSCA, right? Here's another one. Any food additive, color additive, drug, cosmetic, or medical or veterinary device or product, including materials intended for the use as ingredients in such products, like flavors or fragrances, if they have been defined in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act or the Virus Serum Toxin Act and regulations issued under those acts when they are subject to labeling requirements under those acts. So basically, whenever you're required to have labels under another federal act, then you can comply with that act in these cases here. And some of these are crazy. The Virus, Serum, and Toxin Act of 1913. Holy moly. Any distilled spirits, beverage alcohols, right? Wine or malt beverage intended for non-industrial use. Yeah, I know people that drink enough that you could probably categorize it as industrial use. You know, they love craft beer, right? So, wow. So here's another one. If it's not intended for industrial use and it's been defined by the Federal Alcohol Administration Act and the regulations require labeling, then you can follow those labels. Another act is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives. You can follow those labeling standards as well. Another chemical or substance not required to be labeled under the OSHA 1910.1200, any consumer product or hazardous substance defined in the Consumer Product Safety Act and Federal Hazardous Substances Act when they're subject to a consumer product safety standard or labeling requirement of those acts. So you can use those labels. And finally, any agricultural or vegetable seed treated with pesticides and labeled in accordance with the Federal Seed Act. Federal Seed Act. That was a good one. All right, got a lot of actions going on here. So let's take a quick look at the summary of labeling requirements that OSHA has. Now, what OSHA is going to be looking for are the following items to ensure that labeling will be properly implemented at your workplace. 1, designation of person or persons responsible for ensuring labeling of in-plant containers. Make sure you've identified that individual, okay? That's going to be in your written HAZCOM program, okay? That written HAZCOM program, that's not really for the employees. That's for the employer to provide to regulators. So the written HAZCOM program, where it identifies how and where and what and all that good stuff. As far as labeling goes, when you identify who's responsible for labeling and ensuring things are labeled and checking them when they come in, you're going to have to list all that out. It's going to be in your written HAZCOM program. Another thing OSHA is going to be looking for, the designation of person or persons responsible for ensuring labeling of any shipped containers. So receiving and shipping. You have to identify these folks. You also need to have a description of any implant labeling system or custom system if you use one. You have to spell that out in your HAZCOM program. I've seen this a lot. I've gone through facilities where in the past, I look in their HAZCOM manual and it just talks about generic labeling, labeling in general, I should say. But then through the years, they've ended up developing their own labeling system. Maybe they've purchased a label printer and it's got a very specific look and they're using that information on there. That has to be spelled out in your HAZCOM manual. So as you change the type of label you're using, including the look, you want to update that in your HAZCOM manual. Also, you're going to want to list out the procedures to review and update label information when necessary. Here's another one. If materials are transferred into other containers, the employer must ensure that these are labeled as well, unless they fall under the portable container exemption. Now, in terms of label systems, you can simply choose to use the label elements found on the original shipped container or use an alternative labeling system like the NFPA or HMIS label. Some information about labels. This is important as well. They have to be legible. A lot of times you're going to have it present, but it's not legible. It's got to be in English and prominently displayed on the container or readily available in the work area throughout each work shift. Keep that in mind. What if you have employees who speak, other languages? Well, you can add the information in their language to the material presented as long as the information is also presented in English. So you got to do two labels. Employers that purchase chemicals can rely on the labels provided by the suppliers. If the material is subsequently transferred by the company from a labeled container to another container, remember, you have to label that other container unless, of course, it is subject to the portable container exemption. So keep in mind the product identifier is any term that you use, any term, which appears on the label, the SDS, and the list of chemicals in the workplace, and links those three sources of information together. It's that common identifier that you're going to use. If, for example, you use a common trade name like Magic Formula 1 on your container labels, however, the chemical name on the SDS is trichloroethylene, something like that. Again, just an example. I don't even know if this product exists. So you have to use the same product identifier. So the hazard warning also has to be present. It's a brief statement of the hazard effects of the chemical, either flammable or causes lung damage, something like that. Supplemental hazard information has to be included. Chemical manufacturers and importers, they're free to provide additional label information regarding the hazardous chemical and any precautions for safe handling and use. Now, OSHA refers to this as supplemental information. They can choose to provide it. To ensure that non-standardized information does not lead to unnecessarily wide variation or undermine the required information that's it's supposed to be on the label, supplementary info on the label is limited to when it provides further detail and doesn't contradict or cast doubt on the validity of the standardized hazard information. And when supplementary information is added to any label, keep this in mind, its placement cannot impede identification of the information that is actually required by the standard. So keep that in mind. The first thing you want to preserve are all the elements that are required to be on the label. Then you can look for room or space outside of that for supplemental information that may help employees using that chemical. You may see this from time to time, a designation on labels. It's hazards not otherwise classified or defined hazards. Hazards not otherwise classified. That means that an adverse physical or health effect that does not meet the specified criteria for the physical or health hazard classes in the hazard communication system, the HCS, right? It covers effects which either fall below the cutoff value or concentration limit of that hazard class, or is under the GHS or Globally Harmonized System hazard category that has not been adopted by OSHA. Like, for example, acute toxicity category 5 has not been adopted by OSHA. So HNOC, or hazards not otherwise classified, they have no labeling requirements. So you may get some sort of international or imported label, and you may have some of this information on there that OSHA doesn't really recognize. OSHA updated the definition of the term classification in the hazard communication system to reflect the additional hazards represented by materials that are not covered under the globally harmonized system of classification. Namely, like a simple asphyxiant is an example, combustible dust, and pyrophoric gas. These have their own labeling requirements. For simple asphyxiants, the label must contain the signal word warning, and the hazard statement, quote, may displace oxygen and cause rapid suffocation. So no pictograms required there. For pyrophoric gases, the label has to contain the signal word danger, and the hazard statement, quote, catches fire spontaneously if exposed to air, and you use the flame pictogram. For combustible dusts, the label must contain the signal word warning, and the hazard statement, quote, may form combustible dust concentrations in air, and no pictograms required for that one. Those are some examples of what OSHA requires to be on labels. It was a quick rundown. I mean, there isn't a whole lot to it, but I want to take a moment to talk about some of the things I've seen in the past. I mentioned it earlier, legible. A lot of folks will put labels on containers and forget about them. You need to have regular or frequent inspection of all containers that have labels on some sort of housekeeping checklist, safety inspection, whether it's weekly or monthly. You need to include that. Some folks, they ask me all the time, they'll say, hey, should we be doing weekly safety audits or monthly? What do we look for? Do we just look for stuff in the aisle? Well, this is an example. This is the kind of stuff you want to be looking for. You want to make sure that tags are on fall protection equipment. You want to make sure that, aisles aren't blocked. Yes. You want to make sure that folks are in fact filling out or conducting the forklift inspection before each shift. You want to make sure that, preventative maintenance is being done. You want to make sure that labels are legible on containers. So this is another one of these items that you're going to want to throw on your weekly inspection, and make sure that they're legible. Make sure that they haven't been damaged, haven't been torn. Here's another one. Make sure that it actually matches what's in the container. Some places use generic containers and actually reuse them. I've seen this a couple of times where the wrong material ends up in a bucket and something bad happens. There's a chemical reaction. I've even seen 5-gallon buckets that contained a chemical, and they emptied it, they set it down, let it dry, and it is now a trash can. So look for anything that's labeled, anything that looks like a chemical container. Look to see if it's empty, look to see if there's still material in it, and look to see that the label is present and legible and meets all those requirements. So the other issue is with the exemption for portable containers. The general rule is if you pour a chemical into a smaller container and you are in possession of it the entire time, and you use all of it up by the end of your shift, or return the unused portion back to the labeled container, you do not need a label on the smaller portable container. Here's the problem with that exemption. I have seen this every place I've ever been. You have an employee who uses a small container. Maybe they've got a little bit of, mineral spirits, who knows, right? They're cleaning a work surface or cleaning a part, and they use a small container, and they sit it down on their workbench, and they're using it, cleaning these parts and wiping these parts down. Fine. It's in their possession. It's right there. They know, he or she knows exactly what's in it. It clearly falls under the exemption status. They walk away to take their 15-minute break. They go to the restroom. They go to lunch. They run to go get, jump in a meeting. They're having their safety meeting, right? Now you've got a container sitting there, no label, with liquid in it. The worker in the next, workbench or in the next work cell maybe comes by and says, oh, that's probably mineral spirits, or maybe it isn't, I don't know, and wants to grab it, maybe add something else to it, or thinks it's one thing and pours it into a container with something else. That's the problem you're going to run into. So I always told my clients in the past, I've always said, hey, yeah, just because you can do that doesn't mean, not label small containers, doesn't mean you should. I could probably point to many instances in every shop where you're going to end up leaving that material unsupervised out of the custody and control of the original person that poured it in there. So be careful with that one. Make sure that you can, secure that material, that you ensure that chain of custody, if you will. It's very important. So labels in general, again, present, legible. Make sure you know and understand when they're required, and the best place to put them on a container, okay? That's important as well. So go through your facility, go through your workplace, go through your shop, your workshop. If you're in contracting and you have field service work, look through your work truck and work van. Make sure you have everything labeled. You're bringing those chemicals into another place of employment or somebody's home if you're in, home contracting, something like that. So make sure that you protect not just yourself, your company, your workers, but others as well. I hope you enjoyed this quick episode covering labeling requirements that OSHA has. Make sure that you shoot me an email if you have any questions. Make sure you follow the link in the podcast notes as well. Go to the website. As usual, until next time, be safe.
Thanks for listening to the Safety Pro Podcast. Be sure to visit www.consulthoffman.com for articles and information about safety services. To have Blaine read your question on the show, email him at customerservice@consulthoffman.com. Be sure to have 2 F's and 2 N's on Hoffman. Until next time, be safe.